Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to KEI. My name is Ellen Kim. I'm the academic director here at the Korea Economy Institute of America. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Christopher Green, who will discuss his upcoming paper for KEI's Korea Policy Journal on the topic of Korean unification. In December 2023 and January 2024, the North Korean leader called the South Korea an hostile enemy and announced that he will abandon his country's decades-long policy of peaceful unification. Since then, North Korea has taken serious steps to implement its new policy. In his paper, Dr. Green examined three interrelated dimensions of North Korea's transformative policy turn and its implication for inter-Korean relations and the regional security environment. Due to logistics difficulty, we are unfortunately unable to host Dr. Green in person, but we are grateful that Dr. Green is able to join us virtually from the Netherlands. Before we begin, I would like to remind our audience that this is a remote event and we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So please submit your questions through the KI website. Without any further ado, let me properly introduce our speaker. Dr. Christopher Green is an assistant professor in the Korean Studies Department of Leiden University in the Netherlands and a senior Korean Peninsula consultant for the International Crisis Group. He's a former manager of the Seoul-based daily NK. He has published widely on North Korean politics, economy, ideology, and culture, as well as contemporary South Korean broadcast media portrayals of the resettled North Korean migrants. Dr. Green holds a PhD in Korean study from the Leiden University in the Netherlands and an MA in international study with a focus on Asia-Pacific region from Nottingham University in England and a BA in environmental management from Leeds University. Welcome and thank you, Dr. Green, for joining us on today, despite the late hour on your end. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity both to write for your publication and also to deliver some remarks and have a conversation about the issues that it raises right here. You charged me with writing about the implications, the consequences of North Korea's policy pivot. There are many, actually, a long list. And we'll get into most of those in more detail, I think, during our discussion. But first, let me put a few of those consequences out there and also offer a little bit of context as well to the policy pivot that North Korea embarked upon, as you said, at the end of 2023, beginning of 2024. What I'm not going to do is rehash the play-by-play of what North Korea did. They declared their new policy, and then they set about implementing it on the ground in the social and the economic and the military spheres. But most people, I think, because it was such a surprising policy announcement at the time, a lot of people in our field will be well read on the subject, and they'll remember the kind of actions that North Korea took to implement the policy pivot. So we don't need to go through that one by one. But I do want to contextualize it by saying that North Korea's policy pivot didn't come out of absolutely nowhere, even though it felt perhaps like it did. If we look back a little bit further, we could probably have seen something like this coming from the end of the period of diplomacy between North Korea and the US and North Korea and South Korea in 2018 and then the beginning of 2019. What North Korea did thereafter, and the waters of this are muddied by the pandemic, which was a black swan event that makes analysis a bit difficult. But what North Korea appears to have done after the failure of that diplomatic process and having normalized relations with China, which is a very important element of their ambitions for that period, was to have a policy review and then conclude that relations with South Korea were no longer really worth North Korea's time, in a sense. What we saw during that period of diplomacy was that Moon Jae-in's government, the former President Moon Jae-in, showed North Korea very clearly that his government, so the liberal side of South Korean politics, just like the conservative side of South Korean politics, was committed more to the alliance than to ethnic kinship and inter-Korean relations. There was no way that the Moon administration was going to abrogate the alliance in favor of restoring relations between the two Koreas. That was abundantly clear. And I think it gave Kim Jong Un the beginnings of an indication that actually there was not too much to be said for the policy of peaceful unification thereafter. Of course, relations with the United States also floundered at the end of that diplomatic process. And then North Korea implemented and twice, as I recall, revised its law forbidding inflows of South Korean pop culture. Like, they've made a really significant effort since 2020 to shut out inflows of South Korean popular culture, which were undermining North Korea's sort of social cohesion, I think, as they perceived it. So as we can see, this policy pivot didn't come out of nowhere. It's one step on a road that begins with the end of that dialogue process in 2019. Now, as I said, I'm not going to go into the details of the policy pivot and how it was implemented. So let's skip past that and go straight to the implications, which are multifaceted. And I'll just outline them in brief, and then we can pivot to discussing them. So the Yoon administration, the administration of former President Yoon Suk-yeol, their response to this predates the policy pivot, right? The Yoon administration was committed to a hardline position, in a sense mirroring North Korea's escalation. They doubled down on trilateral deterrence with the US and Japan. Famously, President Yoon's initial signature policy was his rapprochement efforts with Japan. This posture, whilst arguably very rational, did lean probably too much to one side. And so when North Korea came with its own policy pivot at the outset of 2014, South Korea's existing hardline conservative position threatened to accelerate what could have become a regional security spiral. So South Korea has found itself caught between, and still is caught between, deterrence and engagement. The question, I think, now is whether engagement is even possible, and if it is, on what grounds. So that's a very important conversation topic for in a second. Of course, South Korea's previous administrations, their actions, especially the Yoon administration's actions towards North Korea and policy on North Korea, reflect societal changes over a significant period of time, obviously. South Korea's societal disillusionment with unification long precedes Pyongyang's doctrinal shift. Young South Koreans, and actually not even that young really anymore because this process has been going on for a while, younger South Koreans have created political space for recalibrating national identity. The identity of the average young South Korean is no longer really strongly tied to ideas of unification and inter-Korean relations, or even really ethnic kinship. So of course that gives the political space for South Korean politicians to pursue alternative visions of unification, which is not to say they've necessarily done so hitherto. I think Kim Jong Un's policy pivot was probably a more dramatic effort to reflect some of the shifting realities on the Korean Peninsula than anything that we've seen from Seoul over a number of years. But in principle, at least, and as we are seeing in the present presidential campaign, there is space for recalibrating national identity and educational narratives in South Korea. And although we don't have any proper empirical data from North Korea on shifting identities there, there's no reason to believe that some of these trends aren't also happening among North Korea's young, especially the more affluent young in Pyongyang. Now, this is necessarily speculative, but I don't think we should ignore the fact that the North Korea is also undergoing generational change, and that brings certain public opinion shifts with it. We just don't know exactly how those are playing out. So we have a now impeached Yoon administration following a hardline conservative stance, and North Korea following a similar stance, much more publicly, in the North. So this has reinforced the logic behind the existing trilateral security cooperation between the US, South Korea, and Japan, which from a foreign policy perspective has been was one of the major successes of the Yoon administration to achieve an improved relationship with Japan, and then with US leadership, especially under former President Biden and his team, to turn that into very, very active trilateral cooperation. We saw the Washington Declaration signed in 2023. That has led to heightened security cooperation. We've seen port visits from American nuclear armed submarines and so on and so forth. And this logic is indeed reinforced by North Korea's hostile position on South Korea. This even creates a window for strong regional integration between these three major countries vis-a-vis China. Right? This raises questions about possible Taiwan contingencies, trilateral cooperation to try and reinforce security in the South China Sea and then around the Korean Peninsula. There are many interesting avenues down which this trilateral cooperation could potentially go. However, over-reliance on hard power in this way does narrow diplomatic flexibility. We certainly saw under the Yoon administration very little in the way of diplomatic flexibility as regards North Korea, and indeed in relation to China, which kind of inadvertently does validate Pyongyang's claims of encirclement. Of course, I understand that those claims, while maybe partly based on fact, are also disingenuous, but nevertheless, they are inadvertently validated by this closer US-ROK-Japan cooperation. I suppose, and we can get into this a bit more, the opportunity here would lie in institutionalizing cooperation without closing off diplomatic channels, and how that might be achieved. Certainly, at least one of South Korea's presidential candidates seems to be hoping that that sort of juggling act can be pulled off, but it's an open question, of course, whether it can. Now, the other unexpected event besides the pandemic that feeds into the narrative here is Russia's war with Ukraine, which North Korea could not, I think, have predicted, but has benefited enormously from, in particular since Vladimir Putin met with Kim Jong Un in the September of 2023 in the Russian Far East, or in that general period. The cooperation appears to have begun a little earlier than that. What North Korea has gotten out of that relationship, of course, is also extremely well known. Trade in munitions, which has been very important for the prosecution of the war. Exports of military labor to the Kursk region of Russia, relatively small in scale, but it all counts, and an opportunity to diversify its relationships away from China a little bit. I don't want to overplay that. China is still North Korea's indispensable economic partner, but having Russia there and having things that have suddenly acquired a value when they didn't have a value before, by which I mean the munitions that North Korea has been exporting, North Korea has been able to improve both its economic, but also importantly its geopolitical position in the context of the conflict between Russia and the West and US-China competition. It's providing North Korea with a very useful set of circumstances for exploitation for its own ends. Now, the question of what South Korea might do hereafter is partly related to the election, and I know we're going to talk about that in just a second. But it is likely that if North Korea's policy position is maintained, and that's an important if, is it tactical or strategic? I think we generally are working on the assumption that North Korea is acting strategically and has long-term intentions towards its current policy pivot, but I suppose it is at least plausible that this is tactical. Anyway, if it is indeed a long-run strategic shift, that is likely to lead South Korea in the direction of bureaucratic and symbolic de-emphasis of unification in its education and in its media and in its politics. One of the South Korean presidential candidates, who will not win tomorrow, admittedly, would like to abolish the Ministry of Unification. And that is an interesting and symbolic potential reflection of the degradation of inter-Korean relations, of course. Anyway, this will play out in many different fields. That's just one example. But this sort of legal and institutional drift towards hardened division is highly likely to continue if the current constellation of forces on and around the Korean Peninsula remains as it is. What I wouldn't expect is for South Korea to reflect any of this in its constitution anytime soon. I mean, for South Korea, this is arguably an opportunity to seize the moral and political high ground on unification on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea has abrogated, perhaps unwisely, any sort of right to speak of itself as having the moral high ground on unification, which was something that it continued to do for many years prior to this policy pivot. So now South Korea, we should assume, will take up the baton of these normative ideas on the Korean Peninsula. But anyway, underneath the surface of that political rhetoric, there may well be institutional and legal drift towards hardened division. My concern as an analyst for International Crisis Group is that this could lead, this lack of inter-Korean communication, an institutionalized drift towards hardened division, in the absence of proper communication channels. And here we're getting into some of what another presidential candidate has put forward, Lee Jae-myung, of course, the idea that you might want to initialize talks in order to achieve the institutional setting for, okay, yes, enemy state status, perhaps from North Korea's perspective, and certainly no friend from the South Korean perspective either, but able to manage that sense of division by restoring some level of inter-Korean communications, potentially restoring something like the 2018 comprehensive military agreement signed in Pyongyang, which North Korea repeatedly failed to uphold for the years before it was abrogated in 2023 by both parties, but nevertheless did lay down some theoretical ground rules, which South Korea largely did adhere to, for avoiding conflict in the West Sea, which is no longer in play. So yeah, restoring basic communication mechanisms without requiring political rapprochement on a grand scale, right, should be a near-term priority, not just for the two Koreas, but for regional actors as well. It's a low-cost opportunity to reduce the risk of unintended escalation, which is with such a highly militarized peninsula, where there are so many military exercises and going on, and the fruits of trilateral cooperation also happening around the peninsula too, and with some degree of tension between China and the US and Russia and the US too, although mostly played out in the latter case in other theaters, is nevertheless these are risk variables for the Korean Peninsula as well. So the role of external stakeholders, by which I mean, yes, of course, the US and obviously Japan too, but also the UN and EU and others, may have to consider recalibrating their approach to Korean relations going forward. I mean, for a long time, it has been the reflexive position of third parties, reflecting the interests of the two Koreas themselves, of course, as is only proper. It has been their reflexive position to say, well, whatever we're aiming for, in the end, we should be looking towards peaceful unification. If peaceful unification isn't what we are looking for, then we need to reorder our arguments and potentially also our policies to try and facilitate whatever it is that we are seeking to achieve on the Korean Peninsula. And I must say, given what we've seen from the presidential candidates for the election and other parties too, I don't think anyone is actually entirely clear what they are looking to see happen on the Korean Peninsula going forward. Everybody agrees that there shouldn't be ruinous war and devastation, but beyond that, it's not yet clear where this goes and what we really are looking to as an end game. Should we leave it there? And
Yep. Thanks, Dr. Green, for very insightful analysis and comments. So there are a lot of things to unpack here, but before we get to all the things that you have stated, let me ask you about North Korea's policy change, because I know we have our audience who may not actually follow North Korea issue very closely. So, and none of our audience have a chance to read your paper yet. So I'd like to start your conversation from where you said that you're so, I mean, everybody who have been watching North Korea closely basically think that Kim Jong Un's announcement to abandon unification is a reflection point in inter-Korean relations. And you also said that this is a strategic shift, not a tactical not the tactical one. And you think that in your paper that North Korea sees some advantages in maintaining this division, not the unity of two Korea. So I would like to ask your assessment on the sort of nature or the driver behind North Korea's decision to abandon unification. You know, if you look at the Korean history of inter-Korean relations, there's a period of, you know, engagement and also this cycle of engagement and confrontation. So what makes this time sort of a real break from that cycle? That's my first question.
Yeah, and it's a good one. I mean, I think...
Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm sorry. That. Yeah. I think even if North Korea's actions were tactical, from a policymaking perspective, in, for example, Seoul, especially Seoul, they would have to work on the presumption that it was strategic, I think. Partly because you kind of have to take North Korea at its word, at least on a subject like this, but also because North Korea, evidently perhaps seeing that its word might not carry all the credibility that it would like, also embarked upon a very, very energetic process of trying to make that policy real on the ground. We saw immediately the destruction of a monument on the outskirts of Pyongyang devoted to the dream of peaceful unification. We saw the deconstruction of government institutions devoted to inter-Korean politics, the United Front Department, a range of its websites targeting South Korea were taken offline. We have heard, but haven't been able to review the outcome, that North Korea has changed its constitution to reflect this, and I expect it to do exactly that. So they've gone out of their way to turn that policy into reality. We have to assume that it is strategic. The reason why this is of particular interest, why have they done it now, whereas they could have done it at any point in, well, frankly speaking, many decades. But in the 21st century, there have been periods of engagement and periods of conservative retrenchment in South Korea, anti-North Korea policy, and then another period of engagement under former President Moon Jae-in. So clearly there have been many opportunities for North Korea to cut off inter-Korean relations, and they more actively attempted to do so perhaps at times in the 2010s as well. 2013 springs to mind. But this time, I think the key change is probably regional geopolitics. North Korea did attempt diplomacy with the United States and made an effort with South Korea as well in 2018 and 19. But since then, we've seen, the hardening of China-US competition. We've seen that extraordinary shift brought about by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the benefits that that's brought North Korea. And then we have the evidence that North Korea took away from its period of engagement with South Korea, which demonstrated very clearly that South Korea was not about to abrogate the US alliance. So if you add these things together, the benefits of a normalized relationship with China, the additional benefits of this relationship with Russia, which will not be sustained at the present level if and when the Ukraine war draws down, but is still probably here to stay, plus the relative lack of benefits on offer from South Korea and the United States, and the unlikelihood of sanctions enforced by the UN Security Council being removed in such a way as to make engagement with South Korea profitable, economically profitable for North Korea. I think those are the factors that really led North Korea to think that this policy pivot could be made, which is not to say that the policy pivot was necessarily a wise one. I think a lot of people have made the point that this does tie North Korea's hands in lots of ways. It has been common over more than 25 years for North Korea to use South Korea, dialogue with South Korea, in order to get to negotiations and dialogue with the United States. By foreclosing that opportunity, that does make North Korea's future foreign policy a little bit harder to implement. They may live to rue the hardness of the division that they are seeking to enforce. But nevertheless, we can see through these geopolitical aspects what is really driving their decision at this time.
Yeah. So here's a follow-up question related to that. Soon after Kim Jong Un announced that he will abandon unification policy, there's speculation, at least among the North Korean watchers, that North Korea will revise its constitution to reflect its new policy. But so far, North Korea hasn't done so, or at least North Korea has not announced that such change has happened. I think that's a correct description. But does that mean that North Korea's policy change on unification is still a work in progress, or there may be some room for us to navigate the question of unification, or is it something that indication that North Korea is having a problem pushing through this policy change radically?
Well, the short answer is I think nobody knows, but we can maybe make some informed speculation on this. For North Korea, the constitution isn't the kind of legal document, the kind of binding document that it is for places like the United States or South Korea or wherever. Rather, it is partly an externally oriented document which is meant to propagandize certain things about North Korea that aren't necessarily true on the ground. So the fact that they have not released an amended version of the Constitution is curious. We could conclude that this is because it is a work in progress, to take your words. Certainly, all the evidence from around the time of the policy pivot was that it was unexpected by many in the North Korean policy apparatus within the government at lower levels. It came as a bit of a surprise. That would suggest that it does take a while to work out what it means in practice and what are the downstream consequences of such a radical policy pivot. And that might be informing some kind of discussions and disagreements potentially about the Constitution. Although I would say at the same time, revising the Constitution isn't the most important thing for the North Korean government, for whom the Constitution isn't, as I say, the kind of preeminent document as it is for some other societies. So we really can't be sure why we haven't seen an amended version of the Constitution. I'm fairly sure that they have amended the Constitution. I think most people are in agreement with that. But maybe it does reflect some degree of disagreement over what that means in practice.
Let's turn to South Korea's response to North Korea's policy pivot. Yes, there has been erosion of South Korean public sentiment on unification, especially among the younger generations. And this has reflected on some of the South Korean public polling on the unification, whether they are in favor of it or not. We have seen particularly low support in the younger generation quite some time. And so you mentioned about, and this changing public opinion over the time going forward will eventually at odds with the South Korea, some of the legal framework, such as the constitutions. So you mentioned briefly about there is a opportunity for policymakers to align the legal framework with the changing opinion while maintaining, maybe ambiguity on the constitutional part. Could you elaborate that part a little bit? Because I'm very curious about that.
Well,
what do you mean
I think
by
probably, yes, please go
what do you
ahead.
mean by legal framework versus the constitutions? And then so for many people who have been sort of believe that unification is the national goal for Korea, and particularly there are still young, older generation who have a separate family in North Korea. As you pointed out, this is a very politically difficult issue for a policymaker to implement. That said, given that there's a change in public opinion, and then this is gonna, let's assume that this is gonna remain unchanged over time, obviously there's going to be growing gap between the reality and the public opinion and the existing legal framework. So how should we address this gap and how do we reconcile it? Should we just leave it alone as it is? Is it better that way for political, expediency? Can you elaborate that a little bit more?
Well, I think for the most part, it will be left alone, at least until it becomes impossible to avoid doing anything about it, right? Political capital is limited. There are other things that the South Korean voters and the new South Korean leader will want to spend that political capital on. And I don't think the number of people who, for example, are still waiting for participation in separated family reunions, tragic as it is, that number is now dwindling greatly and isn't likely to influence policymaking decisions. I think to give the best example of how this creates some discordance in South Korean politics and society is to look at the educational issue. If you look at South Korean textbooks, ethics textbooks, and so forth, you find that over time, dating back decades, incremental change has been towards greater diversity and inclusion in representations in those textbooks, for the most part. So 90% of these textbooks now reflect the South Korea that currently exists, which is not only dynamic, but also diverse, that has more and more non-ethnic Koreans living in it, that is just generally speaking changing. It's more respectful of, well, I don't want to overstate it, but it's clearly more respectful of different minorities in society than was the case, for example, under the military dictatorship of the until 1987, and even more recently going into the 21st century. So this has been a process of change reflecting the increasingly multicultural, increasingly diverse, increasingly dynamic South Korean society. But then the last 10% of these textbooks is devoted to the question of unification and North Korea and sort of what to do about the North Korea problem. And the imperative to unification, which is reflected in the Constitution, leads inevitably to a reiteration of the same position on North Korea and on North Koreans that has been articulated for decades. There's been very little change in that position, which is to say that the Korean Peninsula was artificially divided and that Korean people, meaning those Koreans living on the peninsula rather than the broader diaspora, but the Korean people should be unified, and that should be the imperative of Korean leaders. But that's very odd because it's premised on a sort of an ethnic nationalist description of what constitutes a Korean, whereas the rest of these textbooks is devoted to a much more diverse and colorful description of what Korea is and what Koreans are and how Korean society now operates. So that distinction is very, very, it produces cognitive dissonance when you read the textbooks, that you suddenly see this pivot back to what really does appear to be, I hesitate to use the word anachronistic, but definitely a very different vision of Korea than the one that not only does the first 90% of the textbooks reflect, but also I think exists for the young of Korea today as well. And indeed, because as I said earlier, they're not that young anymore, some of them, also really the middle-aged Koreans too. So those whose identities might be reflective of that last 10% of these textbooks, I think that number is getting smaller over time. And inevitably, that brings about calls for change because it's not reflective of the real Korea that we see around us all the time.
I think that was a very one of the arguments that really struck me, and I find it very interesting. On the one hand, as you said, there is a erosion of South Korean public sentiment unification. But let's talk about the South Korean government's policy response to North Korea's policy pivot. We saw in last year actually that South Korean government announced its own unification policy, emphasizing the freedom and democracy as the backbone of its unification vision, and trying to send the message directly to North Korean people, not the North Korean regime. So that was a very unprecedented, and actually some people found that quite provocative. So what impact do you think that South Korean response might have on North Korean people and also its regime?
Initially, I think the South Korean government, rather, of the day was surprised by the North Korean policy pivot. And the entirely rational response at the time was to do nothing, just to see what this really meant, because it came out of the blue. And then, honestly, I think the Yoon administration's policy on unification in North Korea wouldn't have been vastly different to what it was, whether or not North Korea had conducted its policy pivot. So that's one thing. I think North Korea, sorry, my apologies. The Yoon administration's policy, you say it was unprecedented, but people who read Lee Myung-bak's Vision 3000 document, let's say, of 2008, would have recognized what they were reading. I think maybe it was a bit more extreme in some areas and maybe a bit more liberal in other areas. But of course, South Korean conservative administrations over a long period of time have talked about freedom and reaching out to the North Korean people, going around their government. I worked for Daily NK, and Daily NK also supported and supports a lot of these policy initiatives that come from the conservative side, relatively more than the engagement policies that have characterized the left. So to be honest with you, I'm not convinced that it was unprecedented, and I rather think they might have gone about it that way anyway. But the question is, if North Korea's policy continues as it is, and as we all seem to believe it is a strategic shift, how can South Korea begin to navigate that effectively in the future remains an open question, and tomorrow's election is probably not going to resolve it, certainly not immediately.
Yeah, this is a good segue to talk about the implication, what's next. After what happened after following North Korea's abandonment of its unification policy, and then South Korea's response, their inter-Korean relations really at the lowest point right now. And as you said, there's an election tomorrow. So with a change of government, what opportunities or risks will there be on the question of unification? Do you have anything further you would like to share with us?
Well, I think this is a good time to re-examine and recalibrate South Korea's policy, and elections, of course, offer an opportunity for exactly that. That's all part of the democratic process. Whether or not Lee Jae-myung from the left or Kim Moon-soo from the right win the election, there will at least be some changes in policy. There are other candidates, of course, but they are very unlikely to emerge victorious from the election. I think it is the left-wing candidate Lee Jae-myung who has undertaken the greatest degree of amendment to the traditional policy platform of his side of politics for this election. It's difficult, very difficult, for the progressive groups in South Korean politics to try and find a way through this, because their previous entire unification North Korea policy logic was that if we can engage North Korea and get onto a path of peaceful coexistence, that would ultimately allow us to reach peaceful unification in the end. Like, it's not saying that North Korea is a victim of circumstance and that this can be overcome through dialogue. I mean, I'm obviously oversimplifying for expediency, but that was the basic logic. North Korea has said essentially that is not true any longer, and that end goal of peaceful unification is no longer achievable. So what the Lee Jae-myung policy platform has settled on, reflecting those societal shifts that we've been discussing, plus needing to respond somehow sensibly to the North Korean policy pivot, is a policy of essentially pursuing peaceful coexistence by bringing back in some of the communication channels and the military agreement that we talked about in the West Sea, that can bring a measure of calm and create space that means the two Koreas won't accidentally run into conflict, perhaps in the West Sea, for example. If they can reinstate the military agreement, restore communication channels, without talking about peaceful unification, without thinking about any kind of future unification scenario, simply attempting to bring about sort of a certain amount of calm on the Korean Peninsula for everyone's benefit, then that is the end goal that they claim to seek. The Kim Moon-soo conservative candidate's position is essentially peace through strength, wanting to double down on the trilateral cooperation with Japan and the US, seeking potential nuclear sharing under certain circumstances with the US too, definitely keeping those elements of the Yun foreign policy that people on the conservative right consider to have been considerable achievements. And then Lee Jun-sok for the Reform Party is principally about institutional reform and rationalization for efficiency, and that includes the merging of the Unification Ministry functions into the Foreign Ministry, which in an interesting parallel seems to have been what the North Korean side have done with their United Front Department functions too, which is symbolically very resonant in that it takes this special government ministry, the Unification Ministry, the United Front Department, which indicated that these functions were not part of normal foreign policy, and simply rolling them into the Foreign Ministry, which makes them symbolically part of foreign policy.
So before we get into the Q&A session, I would like to ask one last question. If the progressive camp is win, we are going back to the basically 2017, 2018, when there's a U.S. government and the Korean government basically want to engage North Korea. And, Trump administration indicated that President Trump indicated himself that he would like to, have a conversation with the Kim Jong Un, and we have to see what happens tomorrow in Korea with the election. But if we are going back to 2017-18 period, what do you think will happen? Do you think that things will be different this time? Any things that you would like to share with that on that trajectory?
Yes. I mean, firstly, I slightly question whether the election of Lee Jae-myung would necessarily take us back to 2017-18. I think there are meaningful differences between Moon Jae-in and Lee Jae-myung, their backgrounds, their political factions, their interests, right? It's an anecdote often said that Kim Dae-jung used to dream of playing chess with Kim Il-sung. I'm not the first person, I think, to repeat that story. That just indicates how vested Kim Dae-jung was in this particular area of policy, unification and inter-Korean relations. And you can argue that Moon Jae-in was also very deeply vested in these same elements of the policy agenda. I don't think you can say the same for Lee Jae-myung. And indeed, he does have some skeletons in the closet that are related to North Korea that he may not wish to draw too much attention to, potentially. So you could even argue that the opposite is, to some extent, true. But I think your question really isn't about what will a hypothetical future Lee Jae-myung administration do. I think they've made it quite clear what they're going to try to do. But the question is, will North Korea respond to it? And as they did in 2017-18, leading to the period of dialogue in 2018-19. I think the situation is markedly different now, and there is every reason to think that North Korea may conclude that it isn't in its interests to return to those days, especially because North Korea didn't get anything out of that, economically speaking. North Korea didn't get anything out of its dialogue with South Korea. In fact, it learned that it probably wouldn't get anything out of its dialogue with South Korea, which makes future dialogues with South Korea less attractive. In addition, North Korea has successfully normalized relations with China, at least to the degree necessary to maintain their active economic relationship. And it has an economically productive relationship with Russia. If Donald Trump's administration were to actually have a policy on North Korea, a sort of a well-structured and organized policy on North Korea, then maybe North Korea would look at the United States once again, potentially as an opportunity for dialogue. Maybe they would test the waters of that, and maybe that would necessitate some kind of improvement in relations with South Korea. But as things are, there isn't a policy really in Washington. North Korea does have two good friends in Russia and China. South Korea isn't really an economic alternative, nor is really Japan at this point. So there's every reason to believe that the 2018-19, those days are done. But we shall see. I mean, there is still space. It just seems like the constellation of forces in the region has changed so much that it's less likely that a productive dialogue will come out of this.
Oh, very interesting, and thank you. So we have about 13 minutes left for Q&A, so I'd like to take some questions. So the first question from the audience is that, what influence on North Korea's expectations for the Hanoi summit did the Moon administration have? What factors contributed to the souring of the inter-Korean relations after September 2018? And then second question is, related to the question above, given the outcome of Hanoi summit in 2019, would Pyongyang pick up the line if DC called? Is there something South Korea or Washington could offer that might pique North Korea's interest?
Okay, to take that last question, my understanding is that Washington is testing the waters of restoring communications, has been testing the waters of restoring communications with Pyongyang for a little while now. In the Biden administration period, the North Koreans simply rejected any efforts to restore communications. Now, rumor has it they do listen, but they don't actually respond. Now, you might consider that to be progress, but it isn't a lot of progress. So at the moment, I think we can still say that North Korea is not really, metaphorically speaking, picking up the phone, but they are apparently listening to the messages that are being sent. Forgive me, I didn't hear well the first part of the first question you had there. Would you mind repeating it?
Sure. Can you pull up the first question on the screen? So, what
Sorry.
influence? So, the question is, what influence on North Korea's expectation for the Hanoi summit did the Moon Jae-in administration have? What factors contributed to the souring of the inter-Korean relations after September 2018?
South Korea hoped that by North Korea and the United States reaching an agreement of some kind at Hanoi, that would lead to the conditions for the United States and its allies and the UN to ameliorate the sanctions regime that was then in place and had been put in place, especially the stricter sectoral sanctions, which had been put in place in 2016 and 2017 as a consequence of North Korea's very, very active missile testing and nuclear schedule at the time. The collapse of that summit in Hanoi meant that South Korea, under the Moon administration, wasn't going to be able to produce those conditions that they were hoping to produce. And because the administration of Moon Jae-in adhered to international law and did not want to become a rogue actor of any kind, there was no chance that they were going to pursue economic engagement with North Korea, irrespective of the sanctions regime. The sanctions regime had to be ameliorated to make the space for inter-Korean economic cooperation to be restored or resumed. So the collapse of North Korea-US talks is ultimately what caused the collapse of North Korea-South Korea talks as well.
Mm. The third question from the audience is that thank you for your discussion. South Korea definitely is struggling with the low birth rates, which impacts the workforce in the future. As you mentioned about the textbook, do you think it would be more beneficial for South Korea to be immigration friendly, so encourage foreign immigration, or to unify North Korea with North Korea and open up new workforce? Saying both is possible.
I think it is generally accepted that the demographic crisis in South Korea is extremely severe and likely only to be ameliorated through greater immigration flows from around the globe, not just highly skilled immigration, but also less skilled immigration, and that the social circumstances for lower skilled migration will have to be improved to make it more desirable. I think that's inevitably the case, but it's not simple to move public opinion. And there aren't too many South Korean politicians so far who've been willing to put themselves on the line to try and change the public's mind, right? There needs to be a period of persuasion, significant period of persuasion, to try and move hearts and minds in South Korea and get people on board with a radical change in the level of migration. And I don't think that we're even halfway to that yet. There are those in South Korea who consider, just like there are those in South Korea who think about unification with North Korea as an opportunity for South Korea's major conglomerate companies to rebuild that country. I mean, there's plenty of infrastructure rebuilding that needs to go on in a future hypothetical unified Korea. So there are also those who think that unification or some kind of peaceful coexistence with cross-border movement would bring into play ethnically Korean, Korean-speaking, relatively well-educated workforce that could improve South Korea's economic conditions. But neither of these are especially likely at present, which just exacerbates South Korea's demographic decline and the severity of that demographic situation that the country finds itself in.
There are a couple of more questions, but I think that these two questions are somewhat similar. How politically feasible is it for future, perhaps Democratic Party-led administration to revive a sunshine-style engagement policy? That's one. And the second question is, inter-Korean relations are at a historical low and geopolitics do not lend well for reconciliation. What can a prospective liberal government realistically do? You kind of touch upon the second question, but I'll leave it at you to answer these two together.
Okay. Honestly, I'm afraid the conditions are pretty poor for both of those suggestions. Is there the potential for a revival of sunshine? I think for a revival of a sunshine policy of engagement which also contained an economic component, you need to have those conditions in place that I mentioned a moment ago. The UN sanctions regime has to be significantly ameliorated, presumably through North Korean good behavior. Does that also mean full denuclearization? What a huge question to ask. But clearly there are now many more steps between here and reviving any kind of sunshine-style engagement policy than there were prior to 2016. There was a sanctions regime in place before 2016, but in particular, since the sectoral sanctions, very harsh sectoral sanctions were imposed in 2016, 2017, it has been very difficult for any kind of meaningful inter-Korean economic cooperation to take place. And I cannot imagine, absent the complete collapse of the existing international order, I cannot imagine that the revival of a sunshine policy is likely. And I don't think there are too many South Korean people who would support such a shift anyway, in light of North Korea's nuclear and missile threats and the general souring of perceptions of North Korea. Not of North Korean people, but of North Korea and its government. What can a liberal government realistically do? Not a great deal, but they will attempt what they said if they win the election tomorrow. I should emphasize the result we don't know yet. But if they were to win, they will attempt to do, or they will put forward the idea of doing what they said on the policy, in their policy platform that they intended to try and do. If North Korea doesn't respond or responds negatively, then the Liberal government will simply say, well, we did try, but we can't do anything about it because we haven't got a partner in dialogue. And then they'll go on and look at other areas of policy, which are in any case more important for ordinary South Koreans at this point. So that's the most likely scenario, I'm afraid, is that there is a Liberal victor in the election. That Liberal victor presumably will attempt to follow the policy platform that was laid out before the election, and will run into a hard brick wall called Pyongyang, and that will be the end of that. But I hope for a more constructive dialogue to emerge. I mean, you never know, but the circumstances are not propitious, I would say.
Yeah, obviously North Korea's abandonment unification was all of a sudden, so you never know what can happen in the future. So
absolutely.
Yeah, so we can never be sure about North Korea. So I think we are about to wrap up today's event. So Dr. Green, thank you so much for your time and contribution to Korea Policy Journal. And our audience have not had a chance to read your paper yet. I'm sure that they're very excited to read it. But thank you so much for joining us today. To our audience, thank you so much for joining our event. You'll be able to read Dr. Green's paper and other people's paper for our journal, which will be out this June. So please please check our website in late June. And one more housekeeping issues. KI is organizing a public event on South Korea's election with the 3 former ambassadors to South Korea. So please stay tuned for the event, and then I will look forward to meeting all of you, many of you there. Thank you so much.